Here is an awesome example of atmospheric perspective, where if we ignore the foreground, just look at the colors, the trees here are warmer, same trees but cooler, and then the mountains in the background are considerably more blue. And it's all the same trees, like these ones in the foreground here, but the particulate in the atmosphere filters out the warmer colors. So we can see mountains that have the exact same foliage on them going back, getting cooler and cooler. And another principle of atmospheric perspective is low saturation in the background, so it's more diluted. If we're painting, it's going to have more water in it. And the foreground has much higher contrast, so this dark against white is a great example. And when you paint with these techniques, it really brings this forward and tells the brain that this is foreground and that's background. So nice principles or techniques to use to create depth in your paintings. All right, let's pick some brushes. I always pick the same two. I don't even know why. Whoops, don't even know why I pretend that I'm not gonna choose these two. So from that scene, from skiing the other day, I'm gonna paint that and show you what I meant. But first I need to refill the most important color, French ultramarine. This is my travel paint palette, not my big one, but I just thought I would use this one, and then you can see my travel kit. This is also what I use to paint outside, a little water cup. It collapses, and it's rubber on the bottom, so it sticks to the rocks or whatever you're painting on, which is great. Okay, the first thing I like to do is the sky, but actually I forgot. I think I want to put in a little bar so that you can see what I'm talking about, a little color gradient bar. So I'll just quickly throw that in. Of course, it doesn't have to be done with a ruler, but I went to architecture school, so yes, it does. All right, the first thing I like to do in my little landscapes, I always use atmospheric perspective when I'm painting anyway, but the first thing I like to do is always put the sky in. I turn my paper sideways, use a big moppy brush full of water, just water, there's no pigment on this, and I'm going to use wet on wet technique. And the reason I'm putting water on first is because to do a nice big clean wash, a nice wash is one of the most basic fundamental skills of watercolor. To do a nice clean consistent big wash where you have one big shape of color without any streaks in it, you need the whole paper to be the same wetness so it all dries at the exact same time. And you can't achieve that very easily by just brushing paint onto dry paper. You can do it, but it really takes some experience. So much easier to do a water wash first. And now the sky, I'll mix it over here. I'm not gonna go with the same color palette as the rest of the painting. It's always gonna be, which is this sort of ultramarine base, it's always gonna be more turquoise. And this separates it, but this guy has a tiniest bit of a spectrum of lighter, warmer blue by the mountains. So let's just at the tip here. And another thing, I like to tip my painting upside down. This is already too pigmented, but I'm just gonna roll with it. Hopefully that pigment will fall. Try and go as fast as I can before anything has a chance to dry. And I wanna just dilute that a little bit. Yeah, that's better. And then brush that along, and then take some of the more ultramarine blue. And the reason I'm able to play with this so much is because I'm using a pulp paper. Oh, I'm sorry, not pulp, cotton, a cotton paper. And what I'm using is Winsor & Newton Professional Watercolor, cold press, 100% cotton, a block. I'm going to take ultramarine, always. It's always my base color. It's one of the most common colors you use in landscape painting. And yellow. And I'm going to make my own green. Making your own green is the best way to make a natural green. But there's a little bit of a warmth. So let's just mix in a little bit of ochre. There we go. That's a very warm green. Very happy with that. Okay, so coffee aside, foreground is going to be this very warm series of greens. So that's our sort of foreground colors. Just mixing a few different tones of warm green there. The foreground is always the warm area. And now our next color, so this area is going to be our warmest zone. This is second warmest in here. And so we'll bring a little bit more ultramarine back to that. Basically the same color with a little bit more ultramarine. That's kind of the color palette for that. And then as we get into these mountains here, those are a whole valley away. That is a very dark, very cool color. I'm just going to keep this simple and not introduce too many things. I'm not sure, but it's pretty close. So it's this very blue. All right. And then the last color of the mountains in the background don't have any green in them, but it's a dusty blue. Let's put a tiny bit of purple in there. Okay, and now we're going to put in burnt umber or brown, which will desaturate it. And then a little bit more blue. Well, that's quite pigmented. Okay, and then a little bit of water. That's pretty, I think that's pretty good. Is that blue enough? Yeah. And another reason why it's helpful to have this spectrum at the bottom, and it doesn't have to be a spectrum, it could just be another sheet where you're testing your colors, is you get a chance to actually prove it on the sheet. Is this the color I think it is? Which is very helpful. Kind of want that to be a little bit more blue, bright blue. I don't know, maybe that's the wrong color. There we go, like a lighter blue. Okay, so that's my atmospheric perspective spectrum, where we have warmer in the foreground, moving into a much cooler spectrum. And another piece is that we want to ensure we have contrast in the foreground, so the background should be very watered down, so less pigment. Right now it's very consistent pigment, so you can see the colors, but this should be much more watered down. So I would like to start, I think, with the background. I don't think there's a right place to start, I just feel like it. And I'm just gonna make sure there's lots of water on that brush. I want this to be quite diluted. It needs to be more pigmented than the sky though. So let's just have a go. And the other thing is there is snow on these mountains, so I have to think about leaving little bits of space white, leaving the page visible, because it's the sheet of paper that is the white. Or if you forget, you can come back in with white watercolor paint for white details. But let's try. This is I don't know, this is pretty finicky. Maybe I'll do the white paint on this background section. This is pretty tight in here. I'm tipping it again so that the pigment flows towards the tops of the mountains, because what's important here visually is that there is contrast between the tops of the mountains and the sky. Oops. So they don't blend into each other. Do I wish that hadn't happened? Yes. Can I fix it? Ooh, maybe? Okay. I'm just gonna stop touching that. I don't know if I'll actually be able to fix that. Okay, it's a little bit dark maybe. See if I can just quickly remove a tiny bit of pigment. Just dabbing at it. Never doing this. Just gently dabbing. Okay. I'm gonna let that dry. I don't want to do this shape next to it because it's going to bleed into it while it dries. So I'm going to do this warmer shade in the foreground, kind of bouncing around to which shape I'm doing, just to avoid a wet shape next to a wet shape of color. So these are, what I'm doing here are washes on here. One shape, a shape of color is a wash. Nice, clean, even shape. There's also trees in the foreground here, but I'm just gonna go right over. And then I don't mind if it bleeds, so I will go in I'll have to kind of act quickly here. For the next color, I'll just borrow from that pan. So I'm trying to make this color. That's pretty good. The edge is not wet anymore, so they're not blending, but that's okay. There we go. And I'm being really decisive about how I use the tip of my brush, how I use the different sides of it to move paint around. I'm just doing little marks now to simulate trees on the top of this hill. Or at least that's my intention, that it looks like trees. I'm just softening this line here with some water because there's going to be trees in front and I don't want it to have a hard line behind the trees. Okay, now I need to let this dry because I need this edge to be completely dry and this edge before I can fill in that background. So far, so good. I like, see how the water is pooling here? I kind of like that. It creates visual interest because the pigment's going to settle differently. And I am using fancy watercolors. I'm using Daniel Smith fine, extra fine watercolors, which have really nice granulated pigment in them so that it actually settles really beautifully. You can see here how the pigment has settled really beautifully. That is a desired effect in watercolor. So while I'm waiting for that to dry, let us mix the color. And we're looking for this color. Tons of blue with some of this. I think I even went over to this kind of mossy green. I think I borrowed from that. Even though I said make your own green, I didn't. I didn't. Whoa, I picked up, because this paint was wet and hadn't finished drying, I just reloaded it. I'm picking up so much pigment when I go in there. It's a bit of a waste, so I should be more careful. I can't tell if that's the right color, so I had suggested that we use a test sheet. So let's actually do that. Yeah, that's pretty good. Very pigmented though, so let's just water that down. That's better. I like that. Yeah, that's better. I want it lighter because we do have to put shadows on it. Okay, it's dry enough. Let's do it. There's also snow up in here. I think that's Cathedral Mountain, but we're gonna come in back in with the paint. Even though the paint doesn't have as nice of an aesthetic as just leaving white, it's so tiny that it's gonna be too fidgety.
Okay, we gotta go fast. So again, my priority is the contrast between layers. So I'm making a darker edge. And I'm kind of going a bit quick because I want this to, I don't want it to dry. I would be a little bit, well, I'd be a lot more delicate about this if this was a commission and not a tutorial. Okay, flip her around. Dotting in more pigment to that edge. Okay, let's just blend that out a little bit. Ooh, that's pretty. Okay, we need to let all this dry. Patience, this is the patience part. I think it's dry. Famous last words. Okay, now we have a shadow to add into the mountains, specifically in this area, and it's kind of a dusty, purpley blue, but more blue, but diluted. When I say dusty, I mean diluted. So I'm adding in burnt umber or cool brown, not a warm brown, a cool brown to dilute that. And what I mean is, yeah, that. I mean that. Do I have enough paint mixed? I think so. Okay, so I have drawn in very simply the guiding lines for where shadows will be anchored to. Let's start with an easy one. I'm gonna tip this down so that it's very dark. Oh. Don't use your fingers, Monica. Okay. And then there's maybe I'll work from the back because I sort of lost my lines a bit. Okay, and then there's something in here. And then there's a little shadow there. And there's something in here. And then this guy is quite dark. Well, let's maybe just stick this guy in first. There's a little one in there. And then this one is very dark. I don't know. Okay. Let's put in some teeny tiny little snow patches. You don't need so much of this. But I do need the tip of my brush with less paint on it so that I have that sharp point. And here's what we're gonna do, just put in tiny little white marks. So this has the most and the key here, I wouldn't say I'm doing a fantastic job, but whatever. The key here is that I'm doing irregular sized marks. There's no pattern to it. They're different. Some are small and some are big, and that's what makes it look real. There should not be a pattern to these marks. Okay, let's put in just a little bit. And then, sort of sad this is all the snow that there is, isn't it? It's mid-January. It's January. Okay. And then there is a little bit in the foreground here. I'm just dragging this sort of dry brush along. Gives a bit more of a realistic effect. Okay. So we have our atmospheric perspective. For the sake of this study and this tutorial, I could stop there. But I kind of want to throw in some trees because the foreground is sort of sad. And we want very warm green trees. That'll do. Okay, this brush is really loaded with paint, so I'm not gonna have access to the tip, which means I can't make super detailed or super, fine lines. So I'll have to come in and add those after, or until some of the paint wears off. So just keeping that in mind, let's just see. Yeah, that's very loaded. Just try to make some sort of erratic little gestures to signal branches and whatnot. Again, no patterns. Super important, no patterns. And over here we have this little guy. Okay, a bit rough, but almost ready to call it done. I'm just gonna put in some shadows at the front in the snow. And I'm gonna do quite warm shadows because with atmospheric perspective, we know things in the foreground are warmer. I did make these trees kind of dark to suggest shadow on them. But yes, shadows in the foreground are going to be warmer. Also depends on the time of day and where the sun is at in terms of the color of the shadow. I think so. Okay. This is all very wet, so is it a good idea to paint on top of it right now? No. No, it is not. Are we gonna do it anyway? Yeah. Like this would be like the equivalent of painting in my sketchbook, you know, you can let it be loose. Just be a little loose. Who cares, you know? Just practice. Okay. And then there's shadows, which are a bit more purple. Ah, that's really purple. It's okay to be chaotic when you're painting. It's okay. Does that look like a shadow up the mountain? Not really. But it'll do. Let's just throw in some little shadows there. Yes, I used my finger. Okay, so not like the best thing I've ever painted. Who cares? That's the motto of today. Who cares? I think it expresses what I wanted to explain. And that is atmospheric perspective. Ta-da!